There are moments in history when the world stands a single decision away from catastrophe. In 1954, in a small valley in northwest Vietnam, humanity came perilously close to that line. Dien Bien Phu, a name now synonymous with victory, but at the time, it was France's nightmare and America's ultimate strategic problem. Few know that in the final days of the battle, as French strongpoints sequentially collapsed, as the command bunker was submerged in mud and the wounded lay everywhere, half a world away in Washington, American generals placed an unprecedented option on the table for the first time since World War II, the nuclear bomb. This was not a rumor, not a hypothesis. It was a capability genuinely discussed in closed-door meetings under the cold lights of the Pentagon. In late 1953, France decided to build the Dien Bien Phu entrenched camp with the absolute conviction that they would lure the enemy into a conventional battle where superior Western firepower and air support would crush any offensive. But they did not anticipate that they were the ones being locked in the trap. Artillery was dragged up the mountains, supply lines were severed, and the airspace was contested. By April 1954, Dien Bien Phu was no longer a base. It was a coffin slowly closing its lid. In Paris, the French government was in a panic. In Washington, the anxiety was of a far greater magnitude. For the U.S., Dien Bien Phu was not just about the fate of the French Far East Expeditionary Corps. It was a question about the future of all of Southeast Asia. If France lost, Indochina would collapse. If Indochina collapsed, the domino effect could spread to Thailand, Malaya, and Indonesia. The U.S. would then be perceived as having failed in the global confrontation with communism. Significantly, the U.S. was not officially a belligerent at the time, yet it was funding nearly 80% of the French war effort. Losing at Dien Bien Phu meant America lost in silence. In this context, a plan codenamed Operation Vulture emerged. The initial idea sounded conventional by U.S. military logic. Use B-29 strategic bombers deployed from bases in the Philippines to launch massive airstrikes against the besieging positions around Dien Bien Phu. A sufficient rain of bombs to destroy the artillery positions, paralyze logistics, and create a breach for the French forces to break out. But as generals began their calculations, a chilling reality dawned. The mountainous terrain, the dispersed trench system, and the enemy forces were not concentrated into ideal targets for conventional bombs. To achieve a decisive effect, something stronger was needed. And then, in closed-door discussions, a phrase appeared, first a whisper, then spoken aloud: tactical nuclear weapons. Only 9 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nuclear weapons were still an open wound in humanity's memory. But in the eyes of some U.S. strategists, the nuclear option was no longer an absolute taboo. It was a tool of last resort. The idea proposed was to use 1 to 3 small-yield nuclear devices, targeting the concentrated troop and logistical areas surrounding Dien Bien Phu. Not to annihilate a city, not to sow global fear, but to shatter the siege in a single day. It must be emphasized, there was absolutely no question of the U.S. handing bombs over to France. France had no say in the decision. If it happened, it would be an action entirely controlled by the U.S. The nuclear bomb was no longer a weapon of total war, but a cold scalpel on the table of strategic surgery. But here, the terrifying questions began to surface. If the U.S. used nuclear weapons in Vietnam, what would happen next? President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a general who had commanded the Allied forces in World War II, understood the power of war better than anyone else in the room. He knew that once the U.S. dropped a nuclear bomb again, there would be no one and done. China, having just established its nation, could not stand by while a weapon of destruction was used right next to its border. The Soviet Union, though not directly engaged, would not ignore it. One bomb at Dien Bien Phu could lead to a Sino-American war, nuclear escalation in Europe, and the risk of World War III. Furthermore, Eisenhower faced another problem. The key ally, the UK. The U.S. needed Britain to co-sign the intervention to avoid being seen as unilaterally expanding the war. But Prime Minister Churchill said no, clearly, unequivocally. Without Britain, the U.S. would bear the full political and moral consequences alone, and that was something Eisenhower would not accept. Time ran out. Dien Bien Phu continued to be choked. Operation Vulture from an emergency plan became a discarded option. The nuclear bomb, from the last resort, reverted to a taboo. On May 7, 1954, the victory flag flew. France surrendered. The Indochina War entered a new chapter. No nuclear bombs were dropped. No B-29s appeared over the sky of Dien Bien Phu. But that does not mean humanity was safe. It only means that this time, the world managed to take a step back.